The dust had barely settled on the main street of Caldwell, Kansas, in the summer of 1882, when Theresa Prescott made the single most humiliating entrance of her 24 years of life, and only one man among the dozen watching did not find it funny. She had arrived on the noon stage from Wichita with 2 leather trunks, a carpet bag, a firm set to her jaw, and absolutely no experience whatsoever with horses. That last detail had not seemed important when she packed her belongings back in Cincinnati and accepted the position of schoolteacher for the Caldwell Township School. It had not seemed important on the rattling, bone-jarring stage ride across the Kansas flatlands, where the grass ran in long golden waves to the very edge of the sky. It had not even seemed important when the stagecoach driver, a weathered man named Clem Hooper, had looked at her 2 enormous trunks and her carefully pressed traveling dress, and said with visible skepticism, "You the new schoolmarm." It became important the moment Mr. Gerald Haskins, the town's self-appointed welcoming committee and owner of the general store, led a saddled bay mare called Clover around from the livery stable and said that the schoolhouse was only a mile out of town, and that surely she could ride that far, couldn't she? The wagon was needed for hauling feed, he explained, and the teacher before her had always ridden out just fine. Theresa Prescott had never admitted to weakness in her life. She had grown up the eldest of 4 children in a household where her father worked 14 hours a day at a printing press, and her mother stretched every penny until it screamed, and she had learned early that you did not say you could not do something when doing it was the only option available to you. So she said yes, of course she could ride, and she let Mr. Haskins hand her up onto the saddle with the practiced confidence of a woman who had done this 100 times before, even though she had done it exactly 0 times before, and she gathered the reins in both hands the way she had seen people do in illustrated magazines, and Clover stood perfectly still for approximately 4 seconds. Then a wagon loaded with iron cookstoves came clattering around the corner of the livery, and the iron rang against iron, and Clover decided she had seen enough of that particular situation, and she moved sideways with a sharp, sudden lurch, and Theresa Prescott, who had absolutely no grip with her legs and no instinct for balance in the saddle, went sideways with the horse, and then continued sideways without the horse, and she hit the sun-baked dirt of the main street of Caldwell, Kansas. With a sound that was equal parts thud and dignity departing her body, there was a moment of silence, and then the laughter started. It came from Mr. Haskins first, a short bark he tried to cover with his hand. It came from the 2 men sitting on the bench outside the barber shop, a rolling, easy laugh that said they had seen sights like this before and found them endlessly entertaining. It came from the boy sweeping the porch of the dry goods store, a high, delighted sound. It came from the stage driver Clem, who had the decency to look apologetic even as his shoulders shook. It came from the group of cowboys who had been lounging against the hitching post outside the saloon, who were perhaps the loudest of all, men browned from the sun and comfortable in their boots, and for them, this was apparently the finest entertainment Caldwell had provided in some time. All of them laughed, every single one of them. Every single one except for the man at the far end of the hitching post, who had been leaning against the post with one boot crossed over the other and his hat tilted against the sun, and who now straightened up slowly and walked toward her without hurrying but without hesitating either, and who crouched down beside her in the dust with his hat in his hand and said, quietly and without a single trace of amusement in his voice, "Are you hurt, ma'am?" Theresa looked up at him from the dirt. He was perhaps 28 or 30, lean and sun-darkened, with brown eyes that were entirely serious and a jaw that was sharp and clean-shaved, and he was looking at her the way a person looks at another person they are genuinely concerned about, not the way a person looks at a source of entertainment. "I am perfectly fine," she said, which was not entirely true because her elbow was singing with pain and there was dirt in her hair, but which was what she chose to be. "Good," he said, and he held out his hand, not in the way some men offered hands to women, with a kind of theatrical gallantry that was more about the man than the woman. He held it out the way you hold out a hand to someone who has fallen down and needs to get up, simply and directly. "Let me help you up." She took his hand. He pulled her to her feet in one clean motion, and she brushed the dust from her skirt with as much composure as she could manage, which was considerable because Theresa Prescott had a great deal of composure stored up. "Thank you," she said. "Aaron Bailey," he said by way of introduction. "Theresa Prescott," she said, "the new schoolteacher." He nodded once, as though that answered a question he had not asked aloud, and then he looked at Clover, who had wandered a few steps away and was now sniffing at the dirt with entirely too much calm for a horse who had just ejected a person into the street. "You want me to lead her out to the schoolhouse for you?" he asked. "I can tie her to the back of my wagon. I'm heading that direction." Behind them, the laughter from the men at the hitching post had not entirely subsided, and Theresa heard one of them say something that ended with the word "city girl" and provoked another round of amusement. She did not turn around to look at them. She looked at Aaron Bailey instead, and she said, "I would appreciate that very much." That was how it started, not with grand declarations or meaningful glances across a crowded room, but with a woman in the dust and a man who did not laugh. Aaron Bailey was not a man who announced himself. He had grown up on a cattle operation 20 miles south of Caldwell, the second of 3 sons born to James Bailey and his wife Margaret, and he had spent the better part of the last decade working cattle drives up the Kisham Trail and back, with seasons in between spent helping on his father's ranch. He was 29 years old, steady and capable in the way that men become who have spent years doing difficult work in difficult weather without anyone to perform for. He had a quarter section of land that he had filed a claim on 2 years ago, 8 miles east of town, and he was in the process of building something on it, slowly and carefully, the way he did most things. He was not a man who talked a great deal, but he was a man who paid attention. On the ride out to the schoolhouse, with Theresa seated beside him on the wagon bench and Clover trailing behind with considerably more docility than she had shown in town, Aaron pointed out the landmarks a newcomer would need to know. That creek bend marked the edge of the Harmon Ranch's east pasture. That stand of cottonwoods was where the road split, and you wanted the right fork or you would end up at the old homestead that nobody lived on anymore. The schoolhouse itself was a square, solid building of whitewashed board and batten with a small bell tower and a lean-to shed in back for horses, and it sat in a slight depression in the land that made it look as though the prairie had cupped its hands around it. Theresa looked at it for a long moment without speaking. Then she said, "It's smaller than I expected." "There are 11 students," Aaron said. "They fit. How many of them are yours?" She asked and then immediately added, "I'm sorry, that's an entirely inappropriate question. I only meant, are any of the ranch children in the district yours from your family?" "No," he said without any particular weight on the word. "I'm not married." He paused. "My brother's 2 boys attend, though, Tom Bailey's boys, Sam and William. They're good kids." "That's reassuring," Theresa said, and she meant it. He carried her trunks into the small living quarters attached to the back of the schoolhouse, 2 rooms that were clean and spare and smelled of cedar and old wood, and she thanked him again when he was done, and he nodded and turned his hat in his hands for a moment and said, "You'll want to learn to ride properly. If you're going to be living out here, you'll need to." "I know," she said, with a directness that surprised him a little. "I could teach you," he said, and then seemed to consider whether he had said too much. "Why?" she asked, not rudely but with genuine curiosity. He looked at her steadily for a moment. "Because nobody should have to be embarrassed into learning something they need to know," he said. "And because the alternative is you riding back into town and giving those men at the hitching post another laugh, and I don't think you want that." Theresa Prescott looked at Aaron Bailey for a long, clear moment, and she decided that she liked him. Not in the complicated, uncertain way she would later like him, the way that would keep her awake listening to the coyotes call across the dark prairie, but in the simple, foundational way of recognizing that here was a person who could be trusted. "All right," she said. "When?" "Saturday morning," he said. "I'll bring a better horse than Clover." He did. He brought a steady roan gelding named Sunday, who was so calm and patient that he seemed to have made a personal philosophical commitment to never startling anyone. And he spent 3 Saturday mornings in a row teaching Theresa to ride in the wide, flat pasture behind the schoolhouse, with a patience and methodical care that she found simultaneously impressive and slightly unnerving, because she was used to teachers who showed their frustration, and Aaron Bailey simply did not seem to have any. He taught her to sit correctly first, the weight even in the stirrups, the hips following the horse's movement rather than fighting it. He taught her to hold the reins with a light, consistent contact, not gripping and releasing in panic the way she had instinctively done on Clover. He taught her to use her legs as language, the quiet pressure that said go, the shift of weight that said turn. He walked beside Sunday for the first hour of the first lesson, one hand near the bridle but not on it, watching her hands and her posture with those serious brown eyes. "Stop looking at the horse's ears," he said once. "I'm trying to see where we're going," she said. "Look where you want to go," he said. "The horse will figure it out." She looked up toward the far tree line, and Sunday turned precisely in that direction, and she laughed, a short, surprised sound that she hadn't expected to make. Aaron Bailey almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. Between Saturdays, she thought about him more than she thought she should. She thought about it while she was correcting the spelling compositions of 11 children who ranged in age from 6 to 14, and while she was carrying water from the pump in the evenings, and while she was lying in her narrow bed listening to the wind move through the grass with a sound like the sea, which she had never seen but imagined sounded like this. She thought about the way he had looked at her in the dirt, without laughter, without pity, with only a straightforward human concern that she found, in retrospect, almost radical in its simplicity. She also thought about the fact that he was coming back on Saturday, and on the Saturday after that, and she tried not to read too much into that, because she was 24 years old and a practical woman with a job to do and a school to run, and she had not come to Caldwell, Kansas, looking for a husband. She had come to Caldwell, Kansas, because she was good at teaching, and because the position paid $35 a month, and because Cincinnati had become a place where she felt she was slowly becoming someone smaller than herself, and the advertisement in the newspaper for a frontier schoolteacher had felt, when she read it on a cold February morning, like a door opening. What she had not quite anticipated was the size of the sky. She had read about the Kansas plains, had seen drawings, but nothing in the drawings had prepared her for the actual experience of standing outside her schoolhouse in the evening and feeling the sky press down on her from all directions simultaneously. An enormous, indifferent blue that somehow, after the first week, stopped feeling threatening and started feeling like freedom. She had not anticipated the way the grass moved, or the smell of it after rain, or the way the stars came out at night in such numbers that they stopped looking like individual stars and started looking like a continuous substance, poured across the dark. She had not anticipated Aaron Bailey. He came on the third Saturday with coffee in a tin pot and 2 cups, which he had apparently brought from home, and they sat on the top rail of the fence after the lesson and drank it while the morning warmed up around them. And he told her about the ranch he was building on his quarter section, speaking about it with a careful, quiet enthusiasm that she recognized as the voice of someone describing something they genuinely love, but are cautious about loving too openly. "What kind of cattle?" she asked. "Longhorns mostly, right now," he said, "but I want to breed in some Hereford." Longhorns can take anything the trail throws at them, but Herefords put on more beef and they settle more peaceably. It's worth the work of the crossbreeding. "You know a great deal about cattle," she said. "I've spent a lot of years driving them," he said. "You learn. Do you miss it, the drives?" He thought about that with the seriousness he brought to everything. "I miss the purpose of it," he said at last. "I don't miss the loneliness." Theresa looked at her coffee cup. "I wouldn't have expected a cattle drive to be lonely," she said. "All those men together." You can be surrounded by people and still be lonely, he said, and then he seemed to realize that was perhaps more than he had intended to say, because he looked out over the pasture for a moment as though checking the horizon for weather. Yes, Theresa said. I know that. He looked at her then, and something shifted between them, small and significant, like a door opening inward. The town of Caldwell had a Saturday social every other week in the fall, held in the large room above the hardware store, and Theresa attended the first one in September because Mrs. Haskins, who was Gerald Haskins's wife and one of the women on the school board, told her that her attendance was expected and would be appreciated. Theresa put on her best dress, the deep blue wool she had brought from Cincinnati, and she pinned her hair up carefully, and she walked the mile into town in the early evening while the sky turned colors she still hadn't found adequate words for. The social was loud and warm and smelled of roasting corn and the pine resin of the floorboards, and there was a fiddle player whose enthusiasm made up for what he lacked in precision, and a man who played banjo with his eyes closed in a state of evident spiritual contentment. People danced in the cleared center of the room, while others sat along the walls on benches and talked with the comfortable ease of people who have known each other long enough to have run out of pretense. Theresa knew perhaps 8 of the 20-some people in the room. She had met the Haskinses and the Harmons from the neighboring ranch, and she recognized some of the fathers who had come to register their children on the first day of school. She stood near the refreshment table with Mrs. Annabel Calderon, a rancher's wife of about 40 who had already proved herself to be kind and sensible, and the sort of woman who said what she actually meant, which Theresa found deeply refreshing. "You're looking for someone," Annabel said, without accusation. Theresa realized she had been scanning the room. "I was looking to see if I knew anyone," she said, which was approximately true. "Aaron Bailey's not usually one for socials," Annabel said, with the measured casualness of someone who has correctly identified exactly what you are doing. "But his brother Tom usually brings him." "I wasn't looking for Aaron Bailey specifically," Theresa said. "Of course not," Annabel said pleasantly, and refilled her own cup of cider. Aaron arrived 20 minutes later with his brother Tom, who was broader and louder and easier in company than Aaron, with a good-natured laugh and a habit of greeting everyone he saw as though they were exactly the person he most wanted to see. Tom Bailey found the room delightful. Aaron Bailey found the room tolerable, which was apparently his usual relationship with rooms full of people. He stood near the door for a moment, surveying the space with the same unhurried attention he brought to reading a pasture for weather, and then his eyes found Theresa across the room, and something in his posture settled, almost imperceptibly, like a man who has been looking for a particular landmark and has found it. He crossed the room toward her, and Tom followed behind him, and Theresa felt Annabel Calderon's significant silence beside her as clearly as if the woman had spoken. "Miss Prescott," Aaron said. "Mr. Bailey," she said. "Good evening." Tom Bailey was introduced and was immediately and genuinely delighted to meet the new schoolteacher, and said that Sam and William spoke well of her, and that any woman who could get Sam Bailey to sit still for longer than 5 minutes deserved some kind of civic recognition. Theresa laughed and said Sam was actually very good when he was interested in a subject, and that they had recently dissected a frog together, which had been Sam's idea, and which had required a certain amount of nerve on her part as well as his. "He loves anything outdoors," Tom said. "Gets it from his mother." Aaron had not said much through this, but he handed Theresa a cup of cider that he had collected from the table on his way over, without making any particular ceremony of it, and she took it and said thank you, and he said you're welcome, and the exchange was so small and domestic and natural that it made something in her chest feel very warm in a way that was difficult to attribute to the cider. They danced once that evening, not by grand design but because the fiddle player struck up a polka at exactly the moment when Aaron was standing beside her, and the floor cleared for dancing, and she said, almost without meaning to, "Do you dance?" And he said, after a fashion, and they went out onto the floor. He danced with the same economy he brought to everything, no flourishes, no showmanship, but he had a good sense of rhythm, and he was solid to dance with, and he kept her from colliding with 3 other couples without making it seem as though he was minding her, and she found that she was laughing by the end of the reel, genuinely and freely, and that he was watching her laugh with an expression she did not quite know what to do with. After the polka, they stood on the edge of the floor, and he said, "You're a good dancer." "You sound surprised," she said. "You seem surprised about it yourself," he said. She considered that. "I suppose I was focusing on not falling off again," she said deliberately, and watched his face. He looked at her for a moment, and then he did smile, actually and fully, and it changed his face in a way she was not prepared for, the seriousness giving way to something warmer and younger, and she thought with absolute clarity that she was in a great deal of trouble. October came to the Kansas prairie like a change of philosophy, the golden warmth of September giving way to a sharper, cleaner cold that came off the horizon in the mornings, with the conviction of something that meant business. The cottonwoods along the creek bottoms turned a yellow so bright it seemed to generate its own light, and the grass changed from gold to amber, and the sky on clear days became a shade of blue that Theresa had no name for, a hard, transparent, infinite blue that made her feel simultaneously very small and very alive. She had settled into the rhythms of her teaching, and she loved it with the uncomplicated love of someone doing the work they are genuinely suited to. She loved the orderly progression of lessons, the particular pleasure of watching a child's face when a concept that had been confusing suddenly became clear, the way the schoolroom smelled of chalk and wood smoke, and the lunch pails the children brought from home. She had begun to know her students individually, not just as names in a roll book but as people. Sam Bailey, with his insatiable curiosity and his habit of asking questions that derailed the lesson in interesting directions. Lucia Reyes, who was 11 and extraordinarily precise in everything she did, and who would be, Theresa thought, a formidable woman. Young Peter Harmon, who stuttered badly when he was nervous, but read silently at a level far beyond his 8 years. She had also settled, more quietly, into an awareness of Aaron Bailey that she was not entirely sure what to do with. He came by the schoolhouse on a Thursday evening in mid-October, not a Saturday, which was unusual, and knocked on her door with his hat in his hand and said that he had been to town for supplies and was passing by and wanted to check that she had enough firewood stacked for the coming cold. She did, because Mr. Harmon had sent a quart of it out the week before, but she invited Aaron in for coffee anyway, and he came in and stood in her small sitting room with the careful awareness of a person who understands they are in someone's private space, and she made coffee on the small cast iron stove, and they sat at the table she used for both eating and grading papers, and they talked for 2 hours. They talked about his ranch, which now had a proper house on it, a 2-room structure of hewn lumber with a plank floor and a stone fireplace, which he spoke about with a contained pride that was very evident and very genuine. They talked about Cincinnati, and she described the streets and the river and the printing press where her father worked, and the way the city smelled in summer, which was not always pleasant, and he listened with the focused attention of someone trying to understand a world very different from their own. They talked about books, and she was pleased and a little surprised to find that he read, seriously and widely, whatever he could find, because books were scarce on the frontier, and he had a habit of reading the same ones multiple times. He had recently finished a collection of Ralph Waldo Emerson's essays, which he had borrowed from the Reverend Calhoun at the Methodist Church, and he had opinions about them that were thoughtful and original and not what she would have expected. Emerson talks about self-reliance as though it exists in isolation, Aaron said, turning his coffee cup in his hands. But I've never seen it work that way in practice. Out here, a man who doesn't know when to ask for help from his neighbors is a man who doesn't last long. Self-reliance and community aren't opposites. Theresa looked at him with genuine delight. "Have you considered teaching?" she said. He smiled, that full smile she still wasn't accustomed to. "I considered it," he said, "but I think I'm better with cattle than with children." "You were very good with me," she said, and then felt the color come up in her face at the way that had sounded, though she had not meant it any particular way, only as a reference to the riding lessons, which was how she had meant it, she told herself firmly. "With teaching me to ride, I mean." "You were a good student," he said, and his voice was perfectly steady, but there was something in his eyes that made her decide to look at her coffee cup for a moment. He left when the evening had gone full dark, and she stood in the doorway and watched him ride away across the prairie with the stars coming out overhead in their extravagant numbers, and she pressed her hand flat against the doorframe and stood there for longer than was strictly necessary. The winter came to Caldwell County with seriousness in November. First the hard frosts that turned the ground to iron and glazed the creek with ice at the edges, and then the first snowfall, which was not the gentle, pretty snow of illustrated Christmas cards, but a flat, driving event that came horizontally off the plains and reduced visibility to the width of an arm's length. Theresa had been warned about blizzard conditions and had laid in provisions accordingly: flour and salt pork and dried beans and coffee, and enough firewood to last 2 weeks, because the women of the community had told her with considerable precision what a Kansas winter required. She managed well. She had discovered that she was more capable of managing on her own than she had known in Cincinnati, where there had always been the infrastructure of a city around her, and she found the independence of it both demanding and satisfying in equal measure. Aaron came by on horseback on a clear, cold Saturday in early December, bundled in a heavy canvas coat with a sheepskin collar, leading Sunday the roan on a lead rope. "Still going to ride in this weather?" she asked from the doorway. "I figured you might want to," he said. "A cold day on a good horse is better than a warm day with nowhere to go." She got her coat and her riding gloves, which she had purchased specifically because Aaron had recommended it, and she rode Sunday through the bright, frozen morning, while the snow on the grass sparkled so intensely it was hard to look at directly, and Aaron rode beside her on his own horse, a dark bay called Ranger, and they rode east toward his quarter section without particularly planning to, and ended up at his house, which she had not seen before. She had known it was 2 rooms and a stone fireplace and a plank floor. She had not known that he had made a door with an X-brace that fitted perfectly in its frame, or that the fireplace hearth was laid with flat stones he had clearly selected for their even edges, or that there was a shelf along the main room's east wall made of smooth-planed lumber with wooden pegs below it for hanging coats and tack. It was spare and functional and very clean, and it had the particular quality of a place made by hands that cared about what they were making. "It's beautiful," she said, and meant it entirely. He looked around the room with the expression of someone seeing it through new eyes. "It needs a lot still," he said. "A proper kitchen lean-to, another room eventually." "For what?" she asked before she could stop herself. He was quiet for a moment. "For the future," he said carefully, and then he went to the fireplace to build up the fire, and she went to warm her hands and did not press the subject, though she felt the weight of the word "eventually" and the word "another room" settling around her like something she could almost take hold of. He made coffee on the small cast iron stove in the corner, and they sat in front of the fire in 2 chairs he had made himself, solid and a little rough but perfectly functional, and outside the wind had come up and was moving through the frozen grass with a sound that was lonesome in the abstract but felt, in this particular room, on this particular afternoon, more like privacy than loneliness. "I need to tell you something," Aaron said, abruptly, looking at the fire. "All right," she said. "I have been intending to tell you for some time," he said, "and I'm not good at this kind of talking, so I'm just going to say it plainly." "Please do," she said. Her heart was doing something irregular. "I think about you a great deal more than I think about most things," he said, and that is unusual for me because I am generally a person who thinks about practical matters." He paused. "I would like to court you properly if you are willing. If you are not willing, I will understand it and I won't mention it again, and I hope we can remain friends because your company is something I value very much." Theresa Prescott looked at Aaron Bailey beside his own fireplace in his two-room house on the Kansas plains in December of 1882, and she felt the distinct sensation of a decision arriving that had actually been made some time ago, and which she was only now catching up to. "I am willing," she said. He looked at her then, and the firelight was on his face, and the expression there was not the careful, contained look he usually wore but something open and almost young, and she thought again about that first moment in the dirt of Caldwell's Main Street, and the hand held out without condescension or theater, and she thought that the whole course of her life had hinged on that one gesture, on one man's decision not to laugh. Courting in Caldwell County in 1882 meant Sunday visits conducted in the presence of neighbors or at community events, which was fine as far as Theresa was concerned, because she had not come west to throw away the standards she had been raised with, and it meant that their conversations happened in the presence of others often enough to be respectable and privately enough to be real. Aaron drove out on Sunday afternoons and they went for rides together, or they sat in the schoolhouse sitting room with the door open and drank coffee and talked. And gradually, in the way that two careful people gradually reveal themselves to each other, she came to know him. She learned that he had a dry, quiet humor that appeared without warning and was always worth waiting for. She learned that he was generous without making a performance of it, the kind of generous that showed up as action rather than announcement. She learned that he had been badly hurt once, years ago on a cattle drive, when he had been thrown from a horse and broken 3 ribs and lain in the grass for an hour before anyone noticed he was missing, and that this experience had left him with a particular attentiveness to people who were down, an instinct to go toward them rather than away, which explained, she thought, a great deal. She told him things too. She told him about her father's long days at the printing press, and the smell of ink that had lived in the house of her childhood, and how she had learned to read earlier than anyone expected because the books were always there, covered in fingerprints that smelled of her father's work. She told him about the teacher she had had at 14 who had told her that a girl of her ability should consider normal school, should consider teaching as a profession, and how that statement had felt at the time like a key being placed in her hand. She told him about the loneliness of Cincinnati in her last year there, the feeling of a life that had stopped growing. He listened to all of it with complete attention, and asked questions that showed he had heard not just the words but the meaning underneath them, and she found that being truly heard was one of the most intimate experiences she had ever had, more intimate in many ways than anything else. On a Sunday afternoon in January, when the sky was a white flat nothing and the snow lay on everything in a smooth, unbroken silence, he held her hand for the first time. They were sitting in the schoolhouse, and they had been reading aloud to each other from the Emerson essays that he had now acquired his own copy of, and there was a passage about the soul's capacity for connection, and he had read it and then put the book down and taken her hand from where it rested on the table and held it in both of his and said nothing, and she said nothing either. And the wind moved outside over the snow and the stove crackled and the silence was the most comfortable thing she had ever sat inside of. "Aaron," she said eventually. "Yes," he said. "I think I love you," she said. She had not planned to say it. She had thought it many times, testing the thought the way you test uncertain ice, putting weight on it gradually to see if it held, and it always held, and now apparently she had simply said it aloud. He looked at her for a moment and then he raised her hand and pressed his lips against her knuckles very gently and said, "I know I love you. I've known it since October." "October," she said. "The social." "No," he said. "Earlier than that. The Saturday you laughed when Sunday turned toward the tree line." "I knew it then." She laughed now, and it was the same laugh, surprised and free, and he was watching it with the same expression, and she thought that they were going to be all right. February arrived with a blizzard that lasted 3 days and left the prairie under 4 feet of snow, and Theresa was alone in the schoolhouse for 5 days, which she managed with a competence that surprised even herself, and which made her feel, when the snow finally stopped, and the sky came back blue and brutal and beautiful, that she had passed some kind of test set by the land itself. Aaron came out the second day after the snow stopped, driving a team of horses pulling a sledge, and he brought flour and coffee, and a haunch of salt venison and a woolen blanket he had clearly been using himself because it smelled of his horse and wood smoke. She stood in the doorway watching him come across the white expanse of the prairie and felt something so large and specific that she had to take a moment to simply stand with it before she could speak. "I was worried about you," he said when he reached the door. "I was fine," she said. "I am always fine." "I know," he said, "but I was still worried." "Come in," she said. "There's coffee." There was something different in the air between them after the blizzard, after the 5 days of separation that had apparently clarified something for both of them. He sat at her table with his coat still on because the room had not fully warmed yet, and he said, looking at the coffee cup, "I've been thinking." "About what?" she asked. "About the fact that I don't want to spend another winter worrying about whether you're all right out here alone," he said. "About the fact that I want you to be not alone." He looked up at her. "I want to ask you to marry me, Theresa. If it's too soon, I'll wait. I'll wait as long as you need." Theresa Prescott sat very still for a moment. She thought about Cincinnati and the printing press and the advertisement in the newspaper and the long stage ride across the Kansas flatlands, and she thought about the main street of Caldwell in July, and the dirt, and the laughter, and one man walking toward her without hurrying but without hesitating, and the hand held out without theater. "It's not too soon," she said. He reached into the breast pocket of his canvas coat and brought out a ring, a simple gold band set with a small turquoise stone, which was not what she had expected from a Kansas cattle rancher, and she looked at it with surprise. "It belonged to my grandmother," he said. "She wore it all her life. My mother kept it for me." He paused. "You don't have to wear it if you'd rather have a different kind." "I want this one," she said immediately, and held out her hand, and he put it on her finger and then covered her hand with both of his, and outside the snow lay brilliant and unbroken in every direction, and the sky was that hard, transparent blue, and somewhere in the distance a meadowlark was already singing, months before it had any right to, into the cold Kansas morning. They were married in March of 1883 at the Methodist Church in Caldwell, on a day when the first suggestion of spring was tentative in the air, the smell of thawing earth coming up through the last of the snow. The Reverend Calhoun performed the ceremony, and Tom Bailey stood with Aaron, and Annabelle Calderon stood with Theresa, and the Haskinses and the Harmons and several families whose children attended the school all came, filling the small church with the good noise of a community that had decided to celebrate something. Theresa wore the blue wool dress, the best one, and she had pinned into her hair a small spray of the dried wildflowers that Lucia Reyes had brought her that morning, with the grave precision that was entirely characteristic of Lucia, saying that all brides should have flowers, and that these were the best she could find in February, and Theresa had kissed her on the forehead and worn them. Aaron wore a clean white shirt and his good vest, and had borrowed Tom's good coat, which was slightly too broad in the shoulders for him, and he stood at the front of the church watching her come up the aisle with a look on his face that she felt in her bones, an absolute and unguarded look that contained everything she had come to know about him, the steadiness and the seriousness and the quiet warmth that he did not often put on display but which was always present, the way the land was always present under the snow. Reverend Calhoun's words washed over her pleasantly without quite penetrating, because she was looking at Aaron and he was looking at her, and the essential thing was happening between them rather than in the words. When it came time to say the vows, Aaron said them in a clear, steady voice without faltering, and she said hers with the same directness she brought to everything. And then he took both her hands and said, under his breath just to her, "I've got you." And she understood completely that he meant not just this moment but every moment after it, and she felt the full weight of that promise and found it not heavy but sustaining, the way good ground is sustaining under your feet. There was a dinner at the hardware store's upper room, the same room as the socials, and the fiddle player was there again with his same devoted enthusiasm. And Tom Bailey danced with great energy and questionable skill, and Annabelle Calderon cried in a contained, dignified way that she managed to make look like composure, and Sam and William Bailey ate more pie than anyone had sanctioned, and Aaron danced with Theresa twice, the second time slower and closer than the first. And she put her cheek against his shoulder and closed her eyes and heard the fiddle and the voices and the warm wooden room around them, and felt that she had arrived somewhere real. They moved into his house, their house now, on the quarter section 8 miles east of town, and Theresa left the schoolhouse with genuine sadness, and with the knowledge that the school board would find another teacher for the fall term, which they eventually did, a young woman from Missouri who was, by all accounts, perfectly competent. Theresa spent the first months learning the house and the land with the same focused attention she had brought to learning to ride, asking questions, making mistakes, correcting them, gradually acquiring the particular knowledge of a place that only time and close attention can provide. She learned which corners of the house collected cold air in winter. She learned which of the 2 kitchen windows gave the best light for morning work, and which one looked directly east toward the path Aaron took coming back from the cattle pasture in the evenings, which meant that, without quite planning it, she developed the habit of working near that window in the late afternoons. She learned the sounds of the land, the difference between the wind in summer and the wind in fall, the way the cattle sounded when they were settled, and the different, higher note that meant something had unsettled them. She planted a kitchen garden in May, digging the hard Kansas earth with a determination that made her arms ache for a week, and she put in beans and squash and onions, and a row of sunflowers along the fence that Aaron looked at with mild puzzlement, since sunflowers were not a vegetable. "They're beautiful," she said, as explanation. "They are," he agreed, and the way he said it suggested he was not entirely talking about the sunflowers, which she found unbearably endearing. The ranch grew steadily through that first year. Aaron had a good instinct for cattle and a capacity for hard, sustained work that she came to appreciate as she watched him, and he was careful with money and thoughtful about investment, which meant that the operation grew not in sudden leaps, but in the solid, incremental way of things built to last. He brought in 6 Hereford cows that summer, just as he had planned, and began the crossbreeding program he had described to her in his 2-room house before it was their house, and she listened when he talked about it and asked genuine questions and was interested in the answers, which he noticed and was glad of. She also, in the fall of that first year, discovered that she was going to have a child. She told him on an October evening while they were sitting at the supper table, and she had been trying to find the right moment all day, and then she simply said without preamble, "Aaron, you are going to be a father." He went very still for a moment. Then he reached across the table and took her hand, and she saw his eyes go bright in a way she had not seen before, not emotional in an undignified way, but lit from within, and he said, "Are you well? Is everything well?" "Everything is perfectly fine," she said. "I am always fine." "Yes," he said, and now the smile was coming, the full one that still surprised her every time. "You always are." He was, in the months that followed, magnificent. He did not treat her as though she were suddenly made of glass, which she had half feared he might, because she was not made of glass and had no patience for being handled like it. He was simply more present, more attentive in the quiet ways that she had come to recognize as his particular expression of love, making sure the water barrel was always full so she did not have to carry it, taking on the heavier work of the garden without announcement, leaving small things in places she would find them, a handful of late wildflowers on the window ledge, a cup of hot coffee beside her chair when she was sitting with her mending. He also, one evening in November, built a cradle. He did it in the barn when he thought she was reading, but she heard the sound of the plane on wood and went to look, and found him working by lantern light with a focused expression that she could have watched for hours. The cradle was simple and solid and smoothly finished, with curved rockers that he had shaped with evident care, and when he turned and saw her in the doorway he looked slightly caught out, as though he had been doing something private. "It's beautiful," she said. "It's not done," he said. "It's beautiful," she said again. He turned back to the work, and she stood in the doorway for a while longer, listening to the plane and the wind and the horses moving in their stalls, and she thought that she had not known, in Cincinnati, that this was what happiness felt like. She had not known because she had never felt it this specifically, with this much weight and texture and reality. It was not the happiness of things going easily. The ranch was hard work and Kansas winters were brutal, and she missed her family in Cincinnati with a homesickness that sometimes arrived unexpectedly and sat on her for a day. But it was the happiness of being in the right place with the right person, of feeling that the life you are living is the actual life intended for you, and she would not have traded it for anything she could name. Their son was born in April of 1884, in the house on the quarter section, attended by Annabelle Caldwell, and a woman named Mrs. Feeney, who served as the county's nearest thing to a midwife, and who had delivered more than 40 babies on the Kansas frontier, with a calm and competence that Theresa found enormously comforting during the long hours of labor. Aaron stayed in the main room during the birth, which was proper, but Theresa could hear him moving, pacing in that controlled way of his, and the knowledge that he was just on the other side of the wall was its own kind of comfort. When the baby was born and Mrs. Feeney brought him out, she could hear Aaron's sharp, quiet intake of breath even from the bedroom, and then he was in the doorway looking at the bundle in the blanket with an expression that made everything she had been through in the last 12 hours entirely worthwhile. "Come here," she said, and he crossed the room and sat beside her on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby in his arms and watched him hold his son with careful, deliberate hands, the same hands that built fences and worked cattle and had held her hands across a fire in December. And she saw on his face the same unguarded, open look she had seen at the front of the church, and she pressed her hand over his on the baby's back and said, "Well, well," he said very softly. And then, "James." "For my father, James Bailey," she said, testing it. "James Aaron Bailey," he said, and looked at her. "Yes," she said. James was a good baby, which Annabelle Calderon said was luck, and a healthy one, which Mrs. Feeney said was good genetics and sensible prenatal care, and he arrived in the world with Aaron's serious eyes and Theresa's determined chin, and a set of opinions about when he intended to sleep that were entirely his own. Aaron was a natural father in the way she had suspected he would be, patient and consistent, and physically present in a way that some men of the era were not with their infants, willing to hold the baby and walk with him in the evenings, and sit with him when he was fretful without conveying any impression that this was beneath him or outside his proper sphere. The ranch expanded again in 1885, when Aaron purchased the adjacent quarter section that had been claimed and then abandoned by a family who had not been able to survive the winter of 1884. This was not uncommon. The frontier was beautiful, and it was also genuinely hard, and it selected for the people who could adapt and endure. Theresa had adapted. She had surprised herself with the extent of her own adaptability, though she supposed that she should not have been surprised, given that she had always been more interested in what was real and present than in what was comfortable and familiar. She sometimes wrote letters to young women she heard of, back in Ohio or Indiana or Missouri, who were considering teaching positions on the frontier, and she was honest in those letters. She told them that the weather would be harder than they expected, and the isolation more demanding and the physical work more constant. She also told them that the sky was worth it, and the silence on certain mornings, and the particular pride of competence, and that communities were formed in places like this with a closeness and a mutual reliance that cities rarely produced. And she told them always that the people were worth it, that the people you found out here were real in a way that mattered. She did not, in those letters, tell them that the right person could change the entire shape of your life. Some things you had to discover yourself. The summer of 1885 brought a drought that dried the creek to a string of muddy pools and turned the grass brown by August, which was the wrong month for grass to be brown. And Aaron spent long, difficult weeks managing the herd's access to water and supplemental feed, and came home in the evenings dusty and tired and quieter than usual. Theresa learned during this time that the best thing she could do for a tired man who was worried was not to ask him to talk about his worry, but to have supper ready and James fed and asleep, and the lamp lit in the main room, and to simply be there, a still point in a difficult season, and to put her hand on the back of his neck when he was sitting at the table after supper, and let that say what words would have made awkward. He lost 8 head of cattle to the drought, which hurt financially, and which he felt with the particular pain of a man who takes the welfare of his animals personally. He did not talk much about the 8 cattle he lost, but Theresa knew because she paid attention, and she did not make him talk about it. The drought broke in September, a 3-day rain that came out of the north and soaked the ground until the creek ran properly again, and the grass came back tentatively, and the cattle stood in the rain as though they were grateful, which Aaron said was unlikely, but which Theresa maintained was entirely plausible. He laughed when she said it, and the drought was effectively over between them at that moment, whatever tension it had created releasing with the rain. In the fall of 1885, Theresa discovered she was pregnant again and told Aaron in the same direct way she had told him the first time, across the supper table without preamble. This time he smiled immediately before the stillness and reached for her hand and said, "Are you well?" "I am always fine," she said. "I know," he said. "But are you?" "Yes," she said. "I am very well." The second child was a girl, born in June of 1886 in the same bed, attended by the same Annabelle Calderon and a newer, younger midwife who had come to the county the previous year, a brisk and capable woman named Mrs. Poole, who Theresa found she liked enormously. The girl came into the world with considerably more urgency than her brother had in approximately half the time, and she was loudly and immediately present in a way that Mrs. Poole said showed good strong lungs and that Annabelle Calderon said showed good strong opinions. Aaron held her in the same careful way and looked at her with the same unguarded expression and said, "She looks like you." "She looks like herself," Theresa said. "What do you want to name her?" He thought about it. "Margaret," he said. "For my mother. Margaret Theresa Bailey," Theresa said. He looked at her. "That would please my mother a great deal," he said. "I know," she said. "And it pleases you?" he asked. "Very much," she said. Tom Bailey came out the following week to see his niece, bringing Sam and William, who were now 12 and 10 and considerably larger than the last time Theresa had thought about their size. And Sam held the baby with the grave, precise care of someone who understood that he was doing something important and intended to do it correctly, which was so reminiscent of Aaron that Theresa nearly laughed. The community of Caldwell County had, over the years, become home in the fullest sense. Theresa knew the land's rhythms and the people's rhythms, and the way the two were intertwined in ways that were invisible until you had lived with them long enough to see them. She knew that the Harmon family had a difficult November every year because Mrs. Harmon's mother had died in November years ago. She knew that Gerald Haskins, for all his pomposity, was the first person to organize help when a family was in trouble. She knew that the Ray's family, who were Mexican and whose welcome in the county had not always been easy, were the finest horsemen in the district, a fact that Aaron had acknowledged plainly and without qualification in a way that she had noticed with respect, because it was not always the way things were acknowledged. She thought sometimes about the injustices that were ordinary parts of the world she lived in, the way the Ray's family had to be twice as capable to receive half the recognition, the way the Cheyenne and Arapaho peoples, whose land this had been within living memory, had been moved onto reservations so that land like Aaron's could be claimed and built on. She thought about it and she talked about it, with Aaron and with Annabelle and with whoever would engage with it seriously, because silence on such things had always felt to her like complicity. Aaron listened and thought, and said that he believed the treatment of the native peoples of the plains was a wrong that the country would have to reckon with eventually, and that believing it did not absolve him of the fact that he lived on land that had been taken, and that the best he knew how to do with that was to live well on it and treat everyone he encountered with the same respect regardless of their origin. Theresa thought that was honest and imperfect, and the most that many men would allow themselves, and she respected him for it without pretending it was sufficient. Life on the frontier was full and sometimes difficult and always interesting, which was, she had concluded, the best one could reasonably ask of it. In the spring of 1888, a letter arrived from Cincinnati. It was from her younger sister Clara, and it said that their father had been taken ill, a problem with his heart, and that the doctor had said he should not continue at the press. Theresa read the letter at the kitchen table with James, now 4, playing with the wooden blocks Aaron had made him in the corner, and Margaret, who was nearly 2 and already walking with a determined, swaying confidence, pulling at the edge of the tablecloth. She told Aaron that evening, and he read the letter himself, which she appreciated, the way he always actually read things rather than taking her summary of them. "You should go," he said. "The children," she began. "I'll manage," he said. "Tom and his boys will help. You should go see your father." She went. She took the stage to Wichita and the train from there, and she was in Cincinnati for 3 weeks, and she sat with her father in the front room of the house she had grown up in and read to him from the newspapers and talked with him about the ranch and about James and Margaret, and he looked at the photographs she had brought and said that Aaron looked like a solid man. She said that he was the most solid man she had ever known. Her father said that she sounded happy, and she said that she was. She came back to Caldwell on a warm May evening, and Aaron met her at the stage with both children and the wagon, and James ran to her with the full-speed, whole-body commitment of a 4-year-old embracing something beloved, and Margaret was lifted from Aaron's arms into hers with a serious look that said she had noticed the absence and had opinions about it. Aaron waited while she held them both, and then when she looked up at him over the top of James's head, he stepped forward and put his arms around all 3 of them, carefully and without hurry, and said quietly into the top of her head, "Welcome home." She pressed her face against his shoulder. "How's the herd?" she said against his collar. She felt the laugh in his chest before she heard it. "The herd is fine," he said. Her father recovered, not fully but sufficiently, well enough to give up the press and take up a quieter occupation that her sister Clara managed to arrange for him, clerking for a printer friend 3 mornings a week. He lived for another 7 years, and Theresa went back to see him twice more in that time, and he came once to Kansas, in the summer of 1891, which was the most extraordinary thing to watch. Her father in his city suit standing in the middle of the Bailey Ranch's pasture and looking at the sky with an expression of pure bewilderment that gradually, over the course of the visit, shifted into something like wonder. In 1890, Theresa found herself teaching again. Not in the formal sense, with a roll book and a schoolroom, though she occasionally helped substitute when the district's teacher was ill. She had started in a smaller way, teaching Lucia Rays in the evenings, after Lucia had finished at the district school, and whose family was eager for her to continue her education beyond what the frontier school could offer. Lucia, now 15, was formidably intelligent and hungry for more than the limited curriculum available, and Theresa taught her mathematics and literature and history and natural philosophy 3 evenings a week at the kitchen table, with James doing his own lessons in the corner and Margaret asleep in the next room, and Aaron sitting by the fire with a book or going over accounts, present and peaceable. Lucia Reyes went on, years later, to teach school herself, first in Caldwell and then in Wichita, and the letter she wrote to Theresa from Wichita upon receiving her certificate said, among other things, that she would not be there without the kitchen table at the Bailey Ranch, and that she intended to spend her career doing for other young women what Theresa had done for her. Theresa read that letter so many times the paper wore thin along the fold lines. The decade turned, and the world continued its motion, as worlds do regardless of personal happiness or unhappiness. Caldwell grew, gaining a second church and a proper newspaper and a bank and a physician who set up a practice in a proper office rather than treating patients at the kitchen table. The Kishom Trail cattle drives had slowed and then stopped entirely, replaced by the railways, and the landscape of the cattle industry was shifting in ways that Aaron tracked carefully and adapted to, which was his nature. The ranch grew into something substantial, not large by the standards of the great Texas operations, but solid and well-run and genuinely productive. And when Aaron rode its fence lines in the evening on Ranger's successor, a good gray horse named Franklin, he rode the land of a man who had built something real. James Bailey at 8 was bookish and curious, and spent hours lying on his stomach in the pasture studying things that lived close to the ground, insects and grasses, and the tracks of small animals, and announced with great conviction that he intended to be a naturalist when he grew up, which made Theresa very proud, and which Aaron received with the same serious respect he would have given to a plan to be a cattleman. Margaret at 6 was entirely her own creature, physically fearless and socially imperious and absolutely certain of her own capabilities in all areas, which Aaron said was a natural consequence of having Theresa for a mother, which Theresa was not sure whether to take as a compliment or a gentle observation about her own character, and which she decided was probably both. One evening in October of 1892, Theresa and Aaron were sitting outside after supper in the particular quality of fall light that she had never found a name for but which she had come to love most of all the prairie's many expressions, a low, amber light that made everything look like something remembered, and the children were in bed and the night was coming up slowly from the east, and Aaron said, looking at the sky, "Do you ever think about Cincinnati?" "Sometimes," she said honestly. "Why?" "I just want to make sure this is the life you wanted," he said, "that you didn't give up something you needed." Theresa looked at him. He was 40 years old now, with silver coming into the hair at his temples, and the lines on his face were weather and years and work and laughter, and he was the most comfortable person she had ever been in a room with or outside of a room, and she had loved him specifically and completely for a decade, and the feeling, she noted, was not the same as it had been at the beginning. It was larger and more ordinary simultaneously, the way the sky was ordinary and also the largest thing in the world. "Aaron Bailey," she said, "I did not come to Kansas looking for a husband." "I know," he said. "I came because the advertisement said the frontier needed teachers, and I believed in that and I needed something real," she said. "And what I found was that and also you, and the two things are not separate from each other. This is not a life I settled for. This is the life I would choose again from the beginning, and I would choose it faster the second time." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he reached over and took her hand, the same hand he had taken across the table in February of 1883, the same gesture, the same weight and warmth. "I love you," he said. "I will love you every day until I die, and I suspect beyond it." "That is a very practical assessment," she said. "I'm a practical man," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder and they sat together in the last of the amber light while the night came on from the east, and the first stars appeared in their extravagant numbers, and somewhere in the dark a great horned owl began its steady calling, and the grass moved in a long, slow breath that went all the way to the horizon. The years continued their business, as years persistently do. James Bailey, who had been certain about naturalism at 8, was somewhat less certain at 14, having also become intensely interested in the principles of engineering, specifically after watching the construction of the new railway spur that came through the county in 1898 and befriending one of the survey engineers, a patient man named Mr. Cortlandt, who answered every question James put to him with remarkable thoroughness. By 16, James had read every scientific text available within 50 miles, including the complete works of the Royal Society publications that Reverend Calhoun had inexplicably acquired, and which he lent to James without hesitation, and had written 2 letters to the State Agricultural College in Manhattan about their natural science program. He would end up at that college, Theresa knew before he went, because he had her particular flavor of determination and his father's capacity for focused work. And when you put those 2 things together, they tended to find their way through obstacles. Margaret Bailey at 13 had decided to become a horse trainer. This was not as surprising to either parent as it might have been, given Margaret's physical confidence and her particular gift with animals, a patience that appeared to exist entirely independently of her patience with people, which was considerably more limited. She had been riding since before she was properly old enough to ride, initially with Aaron behind her and eventually alone, and the horses responded to her with a willingness that Aaron said approvingly was a talent you could not teach. "She's going to do something extraordinary," Theresa said one evening, watching Margaret work a young colt in the paddock below the house. "She already does," Aaron said. He was not wrong. Margaret at 13 did things with difficult horses that grown men found challenging, with a quiet, consistent language that was entirely her own. Tom Bailey's sons Sam and William had grown into men and were running their own operations, and Tom had finally been persuaded by his wife Eliza to let the boys take over most of the work and to spend less time in the saddle, which he did with very poor grace, and which improved somewhat when he discovered that Theresa had an adequate supply of books and would trade him one for an afternoon's help with the kitchen garden fence, which was Aaron's weakest structural contribution to the property. This arrangement suited everyone. The community had changed and grown and lost people and added others, and some of the ranchers who had been neighbors in the early years had sold and moved on. Some had died. Some had passed their land to children who worked it. Gerald Haskins had died in 1895, and his wife Martha had sold the general store and gone to live with her daughter in Topeka. Annabelle Calderon's husband had died as well the following year, and Annabelle had managed the ranch with her eldest son and her own considerable competence, and was, by 1900, one of the most respected landowners in the county, which was a fact she received with quiet satisfaction. Lucia Reyes was teaching in Wichita and had written to say she was also married now, to a man named David Torres, and that they had a daughter she had named Theresa, which caused Theresa Bailey to put down the letter and sit with it for a moment in a silence that was too full for speech. In the spring of 1901, James Bailey left for the Agricultural College at Manhattan, packed into the wagon with a trunk of books and clothes, and a set of his mother's careful instructions about eating properly and sleeping enough, and keeping his windows cracked in warm weather, all of which he received with the tolerant affection of a 19-year-old who believes he knows what he is doing and loves the person telling him anyway. Aaron drove him to the stage and shook his hand at the door with a grip that lasted slightly longer than a handshake usually did, and said, "Right when you can," and James said, "I will," and then he was gone, and they drove home across the prairie in the spring morning with the grass already coming up green and the meadowlark singing from every fence post, and Aaron held the reins in one hand and Theresa's hand in the other, and they didn't say much, because some things are better held than spoken. He wrote every 2 weeks, letters that were dense with observations and ideas, and the particular excitement of a mind encountering the full breadth of what the world had to teach it. And Theresa read every letter twice and answered every one, and put them in a box under the bed that was already getting heavy with the weight of the years she had spent writing and receiving letters. Because she had always believed that the people you loved deserved the proof that you were thinking of them. Margaret turned 15 in 1901 and had been offered, by the Harmon family on the neighboring ranch, an informal apprenticeship working with their breeding stock under the supervision of their horse manager, a taciturn man named Reuben Flores, who had more knowledge of horse breeding than anyone else in the county, and who had recognized Margaret's gift with the practicality of someone interested in talent wherever it appeared. Theresa had opinions about a 15-year-old girl working in close proximity to cattle pens and horse operations, and Aaron had opinions too, and they discussed it thoroughly, and Margaret listened to both sets of opinions with barely contained impatience, and then presented, calmly and with considerable detail, exactly why this opportunity was important and exactly what safeguards she intended to observe. And when she was done, they looked at each other, and Aaron said to Theresa, quietly, "Where does she get that?" "I cannot imagine," Theresa said. "They let her go. She came back each evening for supper, and she was happy in the way that people are happy when they are doing something they were made for. And she learned under Reuben Flores with the same intensity James brought to his books. And within a year, Reuben Flores had told Aaron Bailey, man to man, that his daughter understood horses better than men twice her age who had been working with them all their lives, and that she had a future in breeding if she chose it. She chose it, but that was still ahead. On an evening in October of 1902, exactly 20 years from the fall, she had arrived in Caldwell and fallen off the horse and been helped up by a man who did not laugh. Theresa and Aaron rode out together across the prairie they had spent 2 decades making theirs. The grass was amber in the October evening, the way it always was, and the sky was the color she still had not found a name for, and their horses moved at a comfortable walk, and neither of them was in any hurry to be anywhere else. She had thought sometimes, in quiet moments, about the smallness and the significance of what had actually happened that July day in 1882. She had fallen. Men had laughed. One man had not. The difference between those who had laughed and the man who had not was not, she thought, a matter of character categories, good men and bad men. Most of the men who laughed that day were decent men in their own ways. The difference was more specific than that. It was a matter of paying attention to what was actually in front of you, a woman who had fallen and needed help, rather than to what was entertaining about the situation. It was the difference between seeing a person and seeing an event. Aaron Bailey had seen a person. She looked at him riding beside her, 20 years older than the man who had walked across the dirt toward her with his hat in his hand, and she thought that what she had understood in that first moment had only grown more true with time. He was exactly what he had appeared to be. That was rare enough to be extraordinary. "Are you thinking about something?" he asked, because after 20 years he knew when she was in particular conversation with her own thoughts. "The day I fell off the horse," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "What about it?" "I was thinking about what you said, that nobody should have to be embarrassed into learning something they need to know." She paused. "I think you've lived by that more broadly than just horses." He considered it. "I suppose I have," he said. "It's one of the things I love most about you," she said. He looked at her, and the amber light was on his face, and he was 60 years from now and 20 years ago simultaneously, all the years layered together in the way that time does with the people you know completely. "I love you," he said, simple and direct, the way he said everything. "I know," she said. "I have known it every day." They rode back toward the house in the evening light, and from a distance it was possible to see the lit windows of the kitchen, and the shape of the house that he had built and they had made into the center of everything, and the smoke from the chimney rising straight up in the still evening air, and the barn beyond it with Margaret's horse in the paddock moving in a slow, contented circle. The house was quiet when they came in, quiet in the way that a house is quiet when it is full of its own good history, when the walls have absorbed enough years of ordinary life that the silence feels inhabited rather than empty. Theresa lit the lamp on the kitchen table, and Aaron hung up his coat and had on the pegs by the door, the same pegs he had put there 20 years ago when the house was new, and the future was an open field. And they moved around the kitchen together in the comfortable choreography of two people who have shared a space for so long that they have stopped needing to think about where the other one is. She made coffee, and he sat at the table and opened the week's edition of the Caldwell paper, and she brought the cups and sat across from him, and he reached across the paper without looking up and put his hand over hers for a moment, and she turned her hand over and held his, and then he went back to the paper, and she went to the window to look at the evening sky. James would write at the end of the week, she knew. He was in his second year at the college, and the letters had not slowed. Margaret would come home from the Harmon Ranch in the morning, her hair full of dust and her face alight with whatever she had accomplished that day. The Herefords in the East pasture were doing well this fall. Aaron had said at supper, the crossbreeding results better than he had hoped. The winter wood was already laid in. The kitchen garden had given a good harvest, and the root cellar was full. All of it was ordinary, and all of it was exactly right. And Theresa Prescott Bailey stood at her window in the October evening and felt the full weight of a life that had arrived precisely where it was supposed to be, built on ground that was solid because the foundation had been laid with honesty and patience and the simple human decency of a man who had walked toward her rather than away. There was a day in December of that year when a letter arrived, not from James but from a young woman in Topeka named Sarah Green, who had read a notice in the State Teachers Association newsletter about Theresa's earlier years teaching on the frontier, and had written to ask her whether she recommended teaching in rural Kansas for a woman from the East who had never spent time on the frontier. She said she was 23 and had her teaching certificate, and had heard the frontier was difficult and was wondering whether it was too difficult, whether a person like herself, a city person, could find a real life there. Theresa sat down and wrote her back that same afternoon, 6 pages in her clear, firm hand, and told the truth about all of it, the weather and the isolation and the physical demands and the smallness of the communities, and the way the first year felt like learning a completely different language, and the way the sky was worth every word of caution she was offering, and the way the land eventually became part of you in a way that nothing in a city ever quite did, and the way the people, if you let them, could become something like family. She told her about the school children and about writing lessons and about kitchen gardens and about learning to be more capable than you knew you were. And she told her at the end that the most important thing was this, that the frontier had a way of showing you who people actually were, that the veneer wore away fast out here, and what was underneath was what you had to live with, and that in her experience, there were people whose basic nature was to turn toward those who needed help rather than away from them, and that those people existed everywhere, but you found them faster in places where finding them mattered more. She sealed the letter and gave it to Aaron to take to town, and he looked at the envelope with mild curiosity at the unfamiliar name. "New correspondent?" he asked. "A young woman thinking about coming west to teach," Theresa said. "What did you tell her?" he asked. "I told her to come," Theresa said. He nodded as though this was exactly what he expected she would say. "What else?" She looked at him, this man she had loved for 20 years, who had walked toward her in the dirt and never walked away from anything that needed meeting head-on, who had built their life with the same patient, careful hands that had made a cradle and a door that fit its frame and a shelf with wooden pegs, who had held her and held their children, and held the lines of a good operation through drought and hard winters, and the ordinary difficulties that made up a real life. "I told her to look for the right person," she said, "and that you'd know them because they'd be the one who comes toward you when you're down, not the one who laughs." Aaron Bailey looked at his wife for a long, quiet moment in the kitchen where they had eaten 10,000 meals and talked about everything that mattered and raised 2 remarkable people and built 20 years of something irreducibly good, and he said, "That's good advice." "I thought so," she said. And she kissed him on the cheek, and he put his arm around her, and they stood together in the kitchen while December pressed at the windows, and the lamp made a circle of warmth in the center of all the cold and quiet outside. And everything was exactly as it should be, fully and completely and without remainder. All the threads of the story tied off in the only way that made sense, which was this: two people, a fall and a hand, and a lifetime of choosing to come toward each other. Every single day.